We're so pleased to be here today with Ronak Kapadia. He is professor of Women's and Gender Studies at UIC, and the Center for 21st Century Studies here at UW-Milwaukee is really pleased to be co-sponsoring this talk today with Cultures and Communities. And I'm just going to say a brief word about our event series. So we're co-sponsoring this talk today, but we have Friday events virtually every Friday at this time. And they're all on this YouTube channel, so you can check out what we have coming next. Next week, we're hosting a talk by Thea Rio-Francos, who's in political science at Providence College. She's going to be talking about resource radicals in Ecuador and kind of climate activism in South America, Latin and South America. So that will be next Friday at the same time. We hope you'll join us for that. And I'm going to turn it over now to Krista Gransavich, who's going to introduce our speaker. Thanks so much.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Krista Gransavich, and I use the pronoun she, her. And this afternoon, I have the honor of introducing our guest and speaker, Dr. Ronak Kapadia. So Professor Kapadia shared with me that you're welcome to use he, him, or they pronouns, or you're also welcome to refer to him as comrade. So today's event is sponsored jointly by the Cultures and Communities program. So before I introduce Dr. Kapadia and his work, I'll take a brief minute to share my own experience with the program. I first became acquainted with Cultures and Communities as an instructor, and presently I teach two sections of what we call 150, which is our Multicultural America class, which is taught over a broad array of different departments like Women's and Gender Studies, History, and I also teach Ethnic Studies 101 for the local M-Cubed program. So in my classroom and in other Cultures and Communities classrooms, we all build from the principle that learning to work across difference of cultural background, experience, and affinity is essential to intellectual growth and lifelong learning. We in Cultures and Communities prioritize and honor cultural diversity, and along with our students, we occupy a very wide range of identities. We honor these differences, and in our classrooms, work to historically contextualize how those perceived differences have been utilized in attempts to divide us. We know that being critical of our received shared history is an act of engaged citizenship. In our classrooms, we seek to identify and then dismantle barriers, including that which divides academia and the wider world. Cultures and Communities has robust relationships with the Milwaukee community and sustains them through initiatives like the Milwaukee Scholars Program. The questions that we ask ourselves in Cultures and Communities parallel the questions that Dr. Kapadia asks in his work and teaching practice. Questions like, how is our classroom a staging place for questions that address identity and power? When we apply a critical intersectional lens to a topic at hand, what questions, frames, and identities are laid bare? And how are we then compelled to address these emergent ideas? And finally, how can our interactions within academic spaces be understood as iterative and fractal, preparing us to engage with a wide and diverse community, sometimes at a scope beyond our imagining? Perhaps these and other questions may arise during our time together today. With that, a more formal introduction of our guest. Dr. Kapadia is an interdisciplinary scholar of race, culture, war, and empire in the late 20th and early 21st century United States. He is currently an associate professor and the director of the Interdepartmental Graduate Concentration in Gender and Women's Studies and affiliated faculty in Art History, Global Asian Studies, and Museum and Exhibition Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. You sound really busy. His first book, Insurgent Aesthetics, Security, and the Queer Life of the Forever War, was published by Duke University Press in October of 2019. Happy first birthday to your book. The book examines the race radical queer feminist visions, sensations, and freedom dreams of the Muslim International, a constellation of transnational South Asian and Arab visual art and aesthetics that together compromise a rebuttal to the dominant ways we have come to think, feel, sense, and map the world amidst contemporary US global state violence and its forever wars of security and terror in the greater Middle East. He's at work on a new book-length project titled Breathing in the Brown Queer Commons, Migrant Futurisms of Survival, Healing, and Justice, which advances a critical theory of healing justice across multiple transnational sites of security, terror, and war, and amidst the wilds of the US imperial decline. Today, our comrade presents a talk titled, Reimagine Everything, How Insurgent Aesthetics and Queer Collective Care Are Transforming Our Worlds. I wish to note that several students join us today, and 2 are serving as respondents and discussants, Eli Frank and Agnes Lopez. Please welcome them along with our guest, Dr. Kapadia.
Well, thank you very much, Krista, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Krista, for that warm introduction. I'm so happy to be with you virtually on this Zoominar, and I want to say greetings to everybody who's tuning in on the live streams all over the place. I was originally scheduled to be in person, live and in color in Milwaukee about 6 months ago before the world turned upside down to be on your campus. And so I want to first express my gratitude to Professor Rachel Ida Buff for the generous invitation initially to campus, I think maybe 2 summers ago, in fact, and to everyone who's helped me revision and reimagine this virtual visit today, including Maureen Ryan and Jonathan Bruce and Richard Grussin and Nassim Sharegi and Krista Grencevich and Eli and Agnes for moderating today's chat, and everybody else at the Center for the 21st Century Studies, Comparative Ethnic Studies, and Cultures and Communities program at UW-M. I am really grateful to you and delighted to be in conversation. So I'm joining you today from the great indoors on the northwest side of Chicago, on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy. It's already midterm season here at UIC, my home institution, and somehow we're all still doing this. We're still doing this even as the US continues to be in free fall, attempting a patchwork and ill-advised series of reopening plans amidst the proliferation of multiple pandemics, disproportionately impacting Black and Brown peoples, sustained Black-led revolutionary protests since the summer, a perilous general election season, today's latest breaking news, or maybe it was late last night if you were still up like me. All of this, while the sedimented traumas of this past spring and summer's sequestrations have barely begun to register in our collective national consciousness, let alone our individual body minds. So as mentioned in Krista's introduction, I am a queer cultural theorist of late modern wars, and I'm particularly interested in the role of emotion, affect, and feelings in insurgent politics and resistance. So I attend to the minoritarian body and its sensory states as a way of understanding US geopolitics, US global state violence, contemporary war making, and its insurgent undoing. I think it's crucial to recall that our senses, the way that our bodies feel, are vital to any recruitment effort, and that reactivating our sensorium is central to offering not simply a diagnosis of all the horrors of the world today, of which there are many, but to reimagine it all, including alternative models of collectivity, subjectivity, and power that will help us create the world that we want to live in. So I want to start today by talking about abolition, which of course is a concept that is proliferating in mainstream public consciousness in the West today in ways that are provocative and exciting and perhaps also potentially concerning. I think it's crucial to underscore the fact that abolition is a productive and generative project, not only about breaking shackles and dismantling the world, the modern world as it stands now, but about the co-constitution of new worlds and new horizons of being. For me, that entails a new world devoid of systems of power and violence that destroy the life chances of the most vulnerable, a world without prisons, policing, and American warfare, which we know actually do the opposite of providing safety, security, and care, a world without poverty and ecological plunder, where everyone has access to a social wage because governments invest in people rather than profits, a world that fosters restorative and transformative models of justice to deal with interpersonal conflict and harm rather than policing borders and cages, a world where educators, artists, activists, and healers are rewarded rather than punished for their labors and utopian visions and dreams. This is a thoroughly queer, feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-ableist, anti-capitalist, anti-settler vision of the world yet to come. Second, it's worth noting that abolitionist struggles in the contemporary period have foregrounded the leadership and intersectional vision of feminists and queer activists of color. This is not accidental, and we should be more curious about this fact. Why is it that queer and transgender, nonconforming Black and Indigenous people of color are at the forefront of our movements, including here in Chicago? Abolition is a speculative, creative, experimental, world-making practice rooted in Black feminisms. Queer and trans working class people of color are legends within these spaces because they have already been practicing survival strategies and creative prefigurative practices and visionary fiction and mutual aid and harm reduction and transformative justice and healing justice and thinking about safety outside of the system, in radical mothering and in freedom dreaming. Abolition has a unique and complex history in the United States context, and we should commit to a radical study of its many genealogies, along with the study of other fellow traveler type concepts that are equally poorly understood and I think often maligned, terms like decolonization, for example, which also is my cue to remind myself that I'm currently teaching a class on abolition and decolonization at UIC, and so I want to say hi to all of my students who might be beaming in as well today on the live stream. I appreciate you. Third, let's lift up this notion of the idea of linked fate, of shared struggles, of a kind of internationalist and global vision of abolition today as well. When we understand that the US carceral state is not exceptional, but instead a part of a global neoliberal racial regime firmly rooted in the history of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, we begin to see some revealing parallels in relationships. In my own research, I argue that thinking historically about race and gender and sexuality and warfare in a transnational frame better reveals the crucial links between American imperial wars abroad and domestic forms of racial violence at home. As scholars of prisons and empire and the carceral state have well documented, there's a long history of US government warfare on domestic populations of color. While this history of political repression against liberation and decolonial struggles in the US and around the world is varied and vast, the militarized policing deployed against BLM today on our streets is not new and was never just a domestic affair. This is where the scholarship on US empire becomes critical to understanding anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-immigrant policing and imprisonment in the United States, as it clarifies the tangled ideological and material links between the domestic and international contexts of contemporary global state violence and war. In short, in order to dismantle the carceral state, we need to dismantle the national security state as well. More on that soon. But first, a note to my fellow brown folks listening today, non-Black people of color, hello. Let's remember that our past, present, future condition in the Western world is inextricably bound to Black peoples in the Americas. We need to constantly revisit and refine our account of and solidarity with Black folks. That means learning about and witnessing their struggles, subordination, genius, and dreams. Defunding the police and divesting from the white supremacist and anti-Black racist forces in our midst and in our minds, including, for example, in the case of South Asian diasporic communities, by undoing the casteism and Brahminical heteropatriarchy that's endemic to Savarna communities in the diaspora, which continues to make Black and brown political alliances difficult or impossible to sustain. In short, abolition teaches us that a commitment to dismantling white supremacy and racialized terror also involves dismantling other overlapping systems of power, including heteropatriarchy, capitalism, settler colonialism, transphobia, Islamophobia, casteism, Zionism, ableism, speciesism, and beyond. Fourth, and perhaps most cogently for this talk in particular, turning the tide against endless policing and war also necessitates a critical embrace of the radical imagination and speculative thinking of visionary artists and healers in order to transport us beyond what the theorist Achille Mbembe calls the great chokehold of the present. Our political imaginations have been so impoverished by decades of disaster capitalism and neoliberal warfare in the United States and around the globe. If our goal is to challenge the ethical common sense of US state violence, then we need artists, healers, and creative cultural practitioners of all stripes to be at the forefront of innovating new strategies of how to be in right relationship, whether that's mutual aid and restorative and transformative justice, radical relationality, crypt wisdom and care, disability and healing justice, science fiction storytelling and Indigenous or migrant futurisms. These projects are all central to this thing that we're calling abolition. So this brings me now to my primary goal today, which is to share a brand new kernel of my second book project in progress. And what I want to do is let me try to share my screen with you. Let's see if I can magically do this smoothly. Share that. Okay. Can you see my screen? Everyone is off the screen, but I'm assuming you can see my screen, and someone is going to come into the chat and tell me that they can't see it. Okay, it looks good. Awesome. So let me go into presenter mode here so you can see these beautiful slides that I've assembled for you today. And what I really want to do is, in the next 20 minutes or so, is walk through some of the art and activism that's happening in the city of Chicago that I find particularly compelling in light of this discussion about reimagining everything. And even the concept of reimagining has been put under duress of late in ways that are worthy of our discussion. So in this new project that I'm working on, Breathing in the Brown Queer Commons, let me take a sip of my water. I'm trying, as Krista mentioned already, to develop a critical theory of healing justice that proliferates new models of collective survival and what I'm calling chronic wellness, specifically for queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in the context of US imperial decline. And I'm just going to say QTBIPOC for short, and we can unpack the language of coalition and the language of the term QTBIPOC in our discussion. Of course, we are witnessing all of the extraordinary effects of this kind of imperial decline every day in our country and around the world. And so this study asks how contemporary visual art and activism from QTBIPOC migrant communities have participated in creating new models of healing justice praxis across different sites of militarized security and urban war. Before I forget, I also want to just lift up the demands from my own campus at UIC, an organization, collective young abolitionists who are demanding that UIC divest from police and invest in Black students and Black student organizers. This is tied to a larger campaign that's happening in the country. There's been a series of teach-ins in the UC system in California and elsewhere. The U of I system is also thinking through these questions. And so I just want to lift up and name the kind of organizing that's happening on my own campus. But here's my abstract for today, right? And here you'll see that what I'm trying to do is assert that the Black and brown Midwest has become the vital epicenter of 21st century rebellion and insurgency against the dominant security order. I want to talk about, ideas about survival and healing and justice today. I want to talk about, the dystopian here and now of US imperial violence and the way that these artists and activists are informed by the radical protest movements and rebellions that we see all around us, and that they are moving us away from despair and isolation towards coalition and transformation. Now, this is also the moment, of course, where I have to, let's see, can I advance my slide? I have to confess and offer these two memes here to say that while my abstract is fire, what I actually want to plan to do today is perhaps much more modest given the limits of our time together. And so I'm just going to speak for about another 20 minutes or so to leave enough time for our conversations. So here I am reimagining everything, including the shift from abstract to paper. Rather than sharing some already polished piece of writing with you all, I figured that this was a great opportunity to offer instead a series of ideas in progress, things that I've been thinking about, and critically reflect on some key words that have begun to animate this new project, including healing, justice, abolition, breathing, and survival. So my primary research is motivated by the problem of security, as Krista already noted, both as a political tool integral to settler colonial processes and constitutive to the genesis of the modern US nation state and its institutions, as well as security as a kind of collective affective state experienced by race and gendered populations who differentially experience the brunt of state violence in the name of so-called security. Now, national security, like other concepts, modern US gendered racial formation, settler colonial capitalism, neoliberalism, late modern warfare, all of these are fancy critical terms that we use to describe the dramatically unequal and historical exposure to precarity, risk, and bodily violence that people experience across populations. My goal in my work is to shift attention away from the diagnosis of these dominant overlapping structures, not because they're unimportant or theoretically exhaustive concepts, but because they are insufficient. Instead, I want to spotlight the affective structures and aesthetic forms of resistance and reimagination found in racialized public cultures, which explains my focus in this new project on QTBIPOC healing, pleasure, and breath. Breathing in the brown queer commons in the face of so much overwhelming suffering and securitized state violence. Now, I'm not suggesting that we abandon our critique of the dystopian here and now altogether, but instead prioritize or learn from creative spaces of pleasure, of joy, of desire, of fugitivity, rebellion, as well as oldies but goodies like hope, which is taking on a new valence today. Hope, we can talk about that. Healing, justice, survival, as national security regimes explode and as empires topple in our midst. My focus on what I call insurgent aesthetics in my first project, published last year by Duke, thanks for the happy birthday wishes. It is almost exactly a year since this book has come out in the world. This project was aimed at identifying and animating queer and feminist and decolonial and race radical experiments with speculation, with fabulation, and other world imaginings. In a nutshell, I was arguing that our political imaginations have been so starved by the dominant ways of thinking about terrorism and warfare in the 21st century in the US, and that turning to the more expansive world-making knowledge practices of contemporary artists offers us new methodologies of rebellion and freedom from the perspective of those most dispossessed by US war-making in the greater Middle East, as well as their diasporic kin. And so by insurgency then, in my book title, I'm trying to summon, I'm not only thinking about the militarized and racial and religious and colonial targets of the United States and its planetary forever wars, but I'm trying to summon this longer history of subterranean and fugitive consciousness of insurgent struggle, what the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore refers to as infrastructures of feeling against the forces of empire, gendered racism, and capital. This fugitive consciousness of insurgent struggle is a vital resource in making visible so as to undermine the forever war. So here I want to dwell on this next really brilliant quote, I think, from the scholar Lisa Lowe in The Intimacies of Four Continents, where she presciently notes that nothing has been more powerful against the dehumanizing subjugation of a people than the imminent threat of the rebellion and uprising. And certainly we've seen quite a bit of that this year alone. So if my first book was about the state of emergency produced by the fears of post 9/11 national security and the aggressive counterinsurgent policing and surveillance apparatus it's conjured over the forever war period, my new project extends these questions by considering the state of emergence among a new generation of anti-racist feminist migrant activists, organizers, and healers. At a time when the proliferating calamities of global fascism, neoliberal austerity, carceral governance, climate chaos, and endless warfare appear to be ascendant and on the rise across the planet. How do minoritarian artists and activists living in the heart of empire make sense of this dying world order while dreaming up new worlds through their creative practices? So I seek to answer this question by tracing the formation of a radical decolonial feminist healing justice praxis and alternative strategies of resistance against the militarization of urban police violence and the broader domestic war on terror. Healing justice is an intersectional framework created by QTBIPOC activists to center the knowledge of working class, poor, disabled, and Southern or rural healers, to identify how cultural producers holistically respond to generational trauma and violence, and to generate social practices that transform the consequences of their bodily oppression. And here I just want to shout out the work of Kara Page and Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. And as healing practitioner, theorist Susan Raffo further reflects, these systems that we seek to change outside of our bodies are also carried within our bodies, right? That the systems of care in Western medicine in particular that we depend on are also part of the systems of dominance and oppression that we want to transform. She writes that we know that Indigenous, Black, and Brown people have culturally grounded systems of care and support that have been violently disappeared and then often repackaged and sold by people outside of those cultural traditions. So healing justice is more than the fact of healing, which happens to people who care about justice. It's more than the fact of healing, which happens to people who care about justice. I want to talk about that. So my goal in this project then is to imagine a project of healing and justice that centers the lived experiences and critical thought of QTBIPOC communities. In the process, I'm asking questions like, what does it mean to be an embodied practitioner of justice and liberation? How can we recalibrate systems of care that center the lives and bodies of our peoples? This approach is in steep contrast to the mainstream health industry that sees healing as a static, one-size-fits-all strategy. That framework, of course, assumes that in order to be healed, you have to be individually broken. To be healed by these logics is generally imagined to be able or want to inhabit a rich body, a white body, a thin body, a cis body, a gender-conforming body, and so forth. This is a singular and static notion of wellness, and that if you can't access these things or not be productive, then you are somehow not worthy of care according to this ideological system of value. So instead, I want to turn to cultural forms and social struggles that bring back the worth, value, and self-determination of our peoples: sick and disabled, fat, femme, poor, rural, brown, Black, Indigenous, queer, trans, otherwise maligned by systems of power and violence. I agree with scholar activists who contend that BIPOCs are owed legacies of reparations. But redirecting these disparate flows of capital is not only about the downward redistribution of wealth, but of breath too. Breath as a resource for living and as a metaphor for flight and freedom. So I want to turn to the creative and social potential of works that are calibrated as love notes by and for QTBIPOCs. And here I'm just going to breeze through a few slides so that you can see some of the artists that I've been thinking alongside and that I want to lift up here, including the work of For the People Artists Collective and the work of Monica Trinidad in Chicago. I seek to build on the idea here of care work in Black, Indigenous, and other women of color feminisms, which have long tracked the differential dispensation of care, healing, and survival in communities grappling with legacies of slavery, genocide, and racial capitalism. First, I'm influenced by the work of scholar activists in critical disability studies, critical ethnic studies, Black studies, queer and feminist disability and environmental studies, and so forth. These folks include scholars and thinkers like the queer disabled femme writer and scholar Leah Lakshmi Papisna Samara Sinha, and her collection of essays titled Care Work, which of course explores the world of disability justice, which is a movement that centers the lives and leadership of sick and disabled queer, trans, Black, and brown people with knowledge and gifts for all. And Leah wrote this really beautiful essay last week about nobody left behind, but wanting to run like hell, about what disability justice praxis looks like in the current apocalypse. And in vein of the discourse about escape or running away, namely to Canada, which is of course our white settler colony to the north. It's a really beautiful essay in Medium that I encourage you to find. So second, I'm equally inspired by the work of Black studies scholars like Christina Sharp and her beautiful theorization of wake work, which she describes as the conceptual frame for and of living Blackness in the diaspora and the still unfolding aftermaths of Atlantic chattel slavery. Sharp astutely distinguishes the care of wake work or wake theory from state-imposed regimes of surveillance, seeking instead to, quote, find a way to hold onto something like care as a way to feel and to feel for and with, a way to tend to the living and the dying. Third, I want to draw out some of the possibilities also of the coalition between women of color and queer of color feminist and disability theorizing. This is an alliance that Gina B. Kim and Akemi Nishida and Liat Ben Moshe and others have recently called Crip of Color Critique. Kim in particular describes Crip of Color critique as a kind of critical methodology that pulls from disability justice activism and women of color feminist thought, one that reads for relations, as she puts it, of social, material, and prosthetic support. That is, the various means through which lives are enriched, enabled, and made possible. In so doing, this approach honors vulnerability, disability, and interdependency, instead of viewing such conditions as evidence of political failure or weakness. It highlights modes of affirming, organizing, and supporting racialized life in which self-sufficiency no longer registers as an ideal, unquote. So building on the notion of precarity and vulnerability in writings by Sarah Ahmed, Jaspir Puar, Judith Butler, and Kathy Cohen, among others, this form of queer feminist Crip of Color critique is useful to my theorization of healing and justice in that it situates a focus on the state as an apparatus of racialized disablement, whether through the criminalization and police brutality or compromised public education systems and welfare reform. In the process, my study hopefully will document experiments in freedom and healing that is more critical and imaginative responses to US neoliberal and ableist state violence and alternative models of coalition that these violent politics have engendered within multiple political communities. So if my first project was about security of the nation, the second book probes the security of communities in crisis and of the security of the body. Namely, I want to examine how social justice organizers take care of themselves and others in times of resistance and backlash. What modes of resistance and healing are being circulated within movement spaces? And what about the embodied lives and spiritual sustenance of leaders in social movements? Building on the work of scholar activists like Dean Spade and Renya Huang and Hele Hobart on mutual aid and radical care networks, can we think of self-care outside of a kind of neoliberal, individuated, and privatized logic, and instead as offering us a critique of austerity politics and social reproduction? Inspired further by Audre Lorde's insistence that self-care is a radical act of political warfare for the dispossessed, can contemporary healing struggles be reimagined as an ongoing necessary practice of collective survival rooted in community, family, and interdependence? So some other questions that I want to pose in this project as we move forward into our discussion is, what does it mean to advocate for healing and wellness in the context of the US's permanent security wars and surveillance empire? How have the past decades of transformative and healing justice, feminist organizing, prepared our movements for the renewed threats of fascism and domestic warfare that we're experiencing in late 2020? How do everyday people mobilize concepts like health and safety when militarized debates about security and terrorism have crept into every aspect of civic and social life? If war, terrorism, and security are now the grammar through which collective social life is viewed and regulated across urban spaces in the United States, how do activists and healers begin to resist these militarized frames of war and reimagine critical forms of healing, justice, and collective care through the realm of art and activism? Finally, how do activist collectives contest and reimagine these terms creatively, thereby giving rise to new ways of thinking about healing, security, and the future of transformative social change? So one particularly illuminating site in order to ground these explorations of healing justice, which is, I recognize have been quite abstract at this point, to ground these purposes specifically in the conversations that are happening in Chicago and thinking about the links between mass incarceration, military urbanism, and homeland security across North America, but in particular in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee. We can turn to the creative interdisciplinary grassroots alliance of artists, journalists, and activists known as the Let Us Breathe Collective. Co-founded by Cristiana Ray Colon and Damon A. Lotz in 2014 in the wake of the militarized police response in Ferguson, Missouri, to the public outcry over the death of unarmed Black teenager Michael Brown, the Let Us Breathe Collective formed first as a fundraising initiative to bring tear gas protection and remedies, medical and hygiene supplies, and water bottles to Ferguson protesters. Beginning in August of that year, 2014, the Let Us Breathe Collective launched an ongoing series of donation deliveries to support this frontline resistance. Working in collaboration with BYP 100, Black Lives Matter, Hands Up United, and Chicago Artists Against Injustice, the Let Us Breathe Collective has gone on to serve as an incubator space for critical dialogue and activism in the city. Now, of course, the concept of Let Us Breathe follows the premature death of Eric Gardner, a 43-year-old African-American man who said 11 times, "I can't breathe," while he was put in a chokehold for 20 seconds and thrown to the floor, to the ground, face down by New York City police officers on a street in Staten Island in front of his home on the 17th of July in 2014. After Garner lost consciousness, officers turned him onto his side to ease his breathing. Garner remained lying on the sidewalk for 7 minutes while the officers awaited for an ambulance to arrive. The officers and the EMTs did not perform CPR on Garner at the scene, and he was later pronounced dead at the hospital approximately an hour later. The New York City Medical Examiner's Office report said that the cause of death was homicide due to compression of neck, chokehold, compression of chest, and prone positioning during physical restraint by police. "I Can't Breathe," of course, quickly became a rallying cry at protests and mobilizations protesting police violence and the killing of Black men by police, most recently re-evidenced in the videotaped torture and killing of George Perry Floyd Jr. by Derek Chauvin on the streets of Minneapolis on the 25th of May, 2020, which, as you know, sparked a renewed moment of global rebellion and uprising. So I think most compelling for my research on healing justice has been the Let Us Breathe Collective's creation of a breathing room space, this multidisciplinary arts, healing, and organizing hub on Chicago's South Side. The Breathing Room is a Black-led liberatory space that produces cultural events, builds coalitions with Chicago resistance communities, and incubates programs that aim to force prisons and policing into obsolescence. The Breathing Room event series ran monthly, a curated open mic mixing performance with political education and featuring artists, poets, rappers, political scholars, community organizers, comedians, musicians, burlesque artists, and multiple other genres of performance. In addition, the collective offered free meals, writing workshops, and guided meditation, Reiki, or massage. Inspired by the redistributive tradition of the long Black freedom movement, the event series features free childcare, a free store stocked with clothing, books, art, jewelry, and houseware, and a community canvas where participants paint a collaborative piece of large-scale visual art in their 4,000 square foot warehouse space, which was originally the press building for the Franciscan Herald, which the collective began leasing in October of 2016. So while I have been thinking about breath and breathing for many years, given my own somatic processes and my own connections to sick and disabled communities of color across North America, and in the context of the ongoing wildfires raging across the Western United States, it's clear that ideas about respiration and breath have no doubt taken on renewed salience in the context of all that's happened in 2020. A novel coronavirus that principally attacks the lungs has killed more than 209,000 people in the United States alone, a disproportionate number of whom are Black, brown, and poor, as militarized police forces shoot tear gas to suffocate Black protesters and their accomplices, working to downwardly redistribute breath on our streets across the nation. Could there be any more vivid an illustration of the necropolitical power of the racial state and its mortal claims to dominion over the insurgent body and its sensory states? And yet, in the face of so much spectacularized state violence, there is tenderness, abundance, and care in the air today, too. We watch organizers putting their vulnerable bodies on the line for their comrades, passing out provisions like masks and hand sanitizer, rejecting liberal reformist disciplinary co-optations of their struggles, practicing mutual aid as they tear down white supremacist monuments and extinguish the cops and courts in our collective hearts and minds. For critical reflection on the concept of breath and its centrality to the symbolic logics of life and death, I want to turn now to the work of Sean Crowley and his magisterial Black Pentecostal breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, for stories of escape and flight from circumatlantic enslavement and its afterlives. In this moving meditation on the power of aesthetic practices to allow for alternative models of social organization, Crowley describes breathing, the necessity of breath, of breathing itself, as performative act, as performative gesture. What goes unremarked is how breathing air is constitutive for flight, for movement, for performance. We do hear about air, breath, and breathing in an indirect way when we read of the varied forms of punishment that were utilized to inhibit or obstruct air from getting into and out of the flesh. We hear, for example, of heart-rending shrieks, so much that it would seem to be a narrative strategy and rhetorical device, almost. The various stories, however, are not nearly contained to predetermined strategies. These narratives depend upon the repetition of the idea of how insidious and unvirtuous, how violative and violent this particular institution was. So in my own book, Insurgent Aesthetics, I'm of course thinking through the performative dimensions of the minoritized body and pain and their relation to contemporary neoliberal racial regimes of security and war making, as well as the kinds of queer aesthetic strategies of refusal, redaction, rebellion, weightlessness, escape, and flight that activists and artists innovate. But I want to write more and I want to write differently going forward about the unlikely intimacies of bodies and social worlds that are brought together in the space of breath. I think of breath and its redistribution as the glue that coheres social relations. The glue that coheres social relations. There are perhaps two primary animating impulses to this work that I'm going to name by way of conclusion. And here's the first one on your screen. First, this project is offered as a reflection of the crisis of embodied vulnerability and premature death of Black and brown scholars and activists in our country and around the world. I'm inspired by Grace Hong's treatment of the material and epistemological violences of the university the university, particularly as they manifest around the exclusion and extermination of Black feminist lives, alongside the institutionalization of Black feminism. Those things were happening coevally, she argues. Hong examines the university itself as a biopolitical institution and finds in Black feminism a vision for a different relationship to knowledge, futurity, and the political. In particular, Hong examines the writing and activism of Black feminist scholar Barbara T. Christian in the necropolitical site of the university. Christian died of cancer in 2000 at the age of 56, and Hong reflects on this fact through an invocation of James Baldwin's call to bring out the dead, in order to examine the lives and premature death of a range of Black women in the academy. And to this litany of Black women who've died prematurely in the academy, I would of course add the range of QTBIPOC scholars who have died early too, including my own mentor, Jose Esteban Munoz, who died in 2013 at the age of 46. Hong asserts here that to bring out your dead is to remember what must be forgotten, to find the evidence of things not seen, that the notion of American equality and the protection of life is a fallacy, that life is not protected if you are raced and gendered, and that you are raced and gendered if your life is not protected. To bring out your dead is to say that these deaths are not unimportant or forgotten, or worse, coincidental. It's to say that the deaths are systemic and structural. To bring out your dead is both a memorial and a challenge, an act of grief and of defiance, a register of mortality and decline, and of the possibility of struggle and survival. Second, this research is compelled by my engagement with questions of exhaustion, fatigue, fragility, vulnerability, precarity, illness, disease, death, all of these things as structuring logics for and against social movement and intellectual work, most especially in relation to the rise of domestic counterinsurgencies and organizing by radical social justice movement organizers. All the more so given the twin specters of global fascism and global pandemics that meet us in 2020. Now, as an aside, I think that we also need to start talking about coronavirus in the US as a form of low intensity domestic counterinsurgency warfare against minoritized peoples. But we can incorporate a disability or critique of movements and the bodies that comprise those movements. So for instance, feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, via the work of Audre Lorde, talks about the need for a feminist killjoy survival kit and the formation of a queer Crip army that would be assembled, made out of bodies without parts or even parts without bodies. She writes, "Feminism needs feminists to survive. My killjoy survival kit is assembled around that sentence." So in closing, what if we admit that we are burnt out? In a period when liberal and radical discourses alike seem endlessly fixated on a politics of action, we can't afford to neglect the exhausted body, the body that breaks down, the body that strains, that labors in unending struggle. Stress, fatigue, frailty, burnout, war weariness, and emotional expenditure are all inherent elements of building mass movements against anti-Blackness, white supremacy, colonialism, racial capitalism, fascism, and cis heteropatriarchy. As in all aspects of life, without the proper diagnosis, healing, care, and rest, the effects of exhaustion can weaken the capacity of movements to effectively guard against the forces of counterinsurgency. But what would it mean if we made room to consider the implications of our exhaustions in the process of building insurgency? What direction would our struggles take if we troubled this insistence on an ever-approaching future plenitude? So to restate by way of conclusion, here are some of the critical keywords that I promised and that I'm thinking through. Self and collective care, the idea of fragility being tied to militancy, the notion of life and death and that binary relation, the field of struggle that is insurgency and rebellion, the space of subjugated knowledges, both in our institutions like universities and other settings, and of course, questions of healing, justice, and survival. Now, finally, to extend my meditation on approaches to healing justice and the downward redistribution of breath, I want to recite Ross Gay's stirring and speculative poem about Eric Gardner titled A Small Needful Fact. A small needful fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which most likely, some of them in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that wonderful, brilliant, and really resonant talk. I guess I'll let everyone digest it for a moment, and we'll see if any questions start popping up in the chat. But in the meantime, Agnes and I both have a few questions prepared, and we can start with those, and we'll drop them if any questions roll in. First, though, we have a couple comments that I will read. So Emily Claimer says, I just joined because I had a patient at 3 p.m. Cannot wait to catch up because this closing is chef's kiss. Thank you for making this accessible, Ronak. And then I love this poem and just quoted on social media 2 weeks ago. So relevant in these times. And a lot of other words of congratulations and thanks coming in. So everyone feel free to post your questions and we can ask those and address those whenever.
And let me say also, thank you, Eli. And, I'm going to leave my PowerPoint open because there's a lot of stuff that I know I bulldozed through relatively quickly. And if there are things, Eli and Agnes, that, that you want to particularly hone in on, we can go and, gesture a particular slide as well. So I know I posed a lot of questions and I kind of cracked open lots of different kinds of questions in ways that feel vast and overwhelming. And, we can start with any small kernel or things that people are thinking about, or, the kind of organizing and struggles that you're experiencing on your campus in Milwaukee, and what, if anything, resonates with what's happening in your worlds.
Yeah, thank you. So some of these questions I think we prepared ahead of time before this talk, so it might be focused a little more on your Insurgent aesthetics book. But I mean, there was so much to unpack in your talk, so we'll work through that and we'll get started with some of these questions. Okay, so much of your talk and your work focused on queer collective care. And with Rachel, with Krista, Agnes, and a whole wider group, we're working on assembling a digital community archive of the protests here in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin. And we've been guided in our work by Michelle Caswell's idea of an ethics of care, that archivists and memory workers should see themselves in a web of mutual responsibility with those whose lives and politics that they're trying to document. So my question is, how might this ethics of care shift when we take into account what you've been talking about with queer collective care? What can we as archivists trying to document this movement learn from those ideas and from this new generation of activists? And then Krista's introduction mentioned that you're also involved in UIC's museum studies program. So I'm wondering if you have any personal reflections on how these ideas have influenced your work in museum and memory work.
Well, that's such a brilliant, web of questions. Thank you, Eli. So, the thing about ethics of care in relationship to the curatorial and digital work that you are working on collectively, let me chip away at that first, which is to say that this is about kind of ethical and political relationship to knowledge production, right? It's a recognition that the people that we're studying, that we're in conversation with, that we're struggling with, that we want to develop a kind of right relationship with those groups of people. And that so much of what happens with social movements in informed scholarship is that academics kind of tour in and pilfer ideas from movement spaces and then take that back and circulate that in the academy in ways that are deeply inaccessible, or that are not at all in conversation with the folks who are producing the knowledge. And I think, my first book, Insurgent Aesthetics, was about artists, but it was a very select kind of radical cohort of artists who understood themselves as archivists and as activists and as critical theorists of the US security state. They were all those things simultaneously, even though they were creative cultural practitioners too. And I think this is really important to remember, that artists, activists, culture producers, healers, as I've been talking about today, these are people who are deeply interdisciplinary, who want to speak to lots of different communities simultaneously. And that's tricky. That's not easy work, just as we're doing, right? And we're meeting for the first time and getting a chance to talk to each other and learn about each other's projects. And so that takes time. it has a different kind of temporality than the sort of fast-paced social media production of protest movements in this moment, where every day there's a new news cycle that turns over. And so part of what I think I'm hearing you talk about is like, what does it mean? An ethics of care is about staying with something, abiding with something, recognizing that even if the news cycle turns, that your commitments are deep and vast, and they grow and they change over time. A recognition that people are knowledge producers, no matter where they're situated, whether they're in the university as we are, or in other spaces, and that knowledge often circulates in communities, and then it doesn't necessarily transfer out. So how do you translate that knowledge to other spaces? I'm thinking about that. That's partly about an ethics of care. You mentioned the language of mutual responsibility, and I think about this a lot because, in my first book, all of the people that I write about are people who are my friends and comrades over the period of a decade, since I was a graduate student onwards. And they're all living artists, living and working artists in the US and Europe. And that means that I have to develop a different relationship to my writing practice, because I'm not writing about the 17th century or, some dusty archive where people are dead and long gone. So, dealing with life, dealing with living contemporary figures, that's fraught and complicated for all the reasons that we might expect, but it's also beautiful and compelling and capacious at the same time, because it means that now those artists who I was writing about are now my readers and now my audience, and they're my interlocutors. And my relationship to them has even changed over the span of the last year since the book has come out in the world. And so it's really making me think differently about the second book project. You note that I make a point here in one of my earliest slides to mention For the People Artist Collective, and to mention, I'm trying to scroll here to see if I can quickly find it, to mention the work of Monica Trinidad and all of these other artists whose work I want to lift up and name. It's probably because I'm saying that this work is not just about the arts of the social movements. They're actually theorists and critics and scholars and archivists themselves who are documenting their practices, and that it's incumbent on the rest of us to lift up those spaces and also proliferate their kinds of knowledges as well. So that's how I'm thinking about this relationship of ethics of care, as you put it.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions piling up in the chat. So I'll read one of those, and then maybe we can get back to some other questions that we have. So
I'm going to stop sharing, Eli, because I realized that people weren't able to see you. And now that
I'm not sure we want that. But
well, now you're alive and in charge on the screen as well with me.
Okay, so we have one question here that says, can you say more about your understanding of healing that neither represses trauma nor romanticizes resilience?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And it is the core work that I'm engaged with, that in ways that make it feel tricky to answer this question in a pithy or a brief way, other than to say, I'm informed by disability justice, CRIP theory, disability studies, theorizations about wellness and healing, and the idea that the goal is not simply to repair a certain individuated body, right? There's a different relationship to how we think about bodies and their relationship to the social world. And so healing, to me, is like, this has become a key word in a certain way in liberation struggles that I want to track over the last couple decades. But healing has always been central to liberation struggles, right? It's been the work of the Black Panther parties. It was the work of mid-20th century radical resistance struggles, decolonization struggles, right? The idea of getting right within, being in right relationship with community, and that work is not part of what's happened, I think, in the last decade or so. And one of the impetuses behind this project is that self-care has become such a useless term, right? It's like, oh, comrade, do self-care on the weekend and go to the spa and then come back to the movement or come back to your work. And as if it's, again, all on the individual in order to take care of themselves because of the vestiges and violences of capitalism. And my argument is like, and it's an argument that a lot of people are making, which is that we need to talk about collective forms of care, right? Which have existed and have these long, rich traditions, as I mentioned, but that the notion of self-care needs to also internalize a critique of austerity politics and neoliberalism of the last 4 decades. Of why do we need spa in order to survive this Zoom life, right? Or even just the kind of language and discourses that have emerged of like how we are talking to each other about how to have less screen time, or make sure we get out for a walk and make sure we are in our bodies, if at least for 30 minutes. I made sure to do it before today's talk because I was like, oh, the sun is going to set. I need to get outside, right? That's all this kind of individuated logic. And counterposed to that is the webs of mutual aid and restorative and transformative justice, and the kind of feminist organizing of criminalized survivors of the carceral state. Like, all of that work is about this kind of collective forms of care, right? That are sort of trickling down into mainstream consciousness, I think. You know, there's discussion of mutual aid societies in ways that have proliferated now that wasn't so maybe even 5 or 10 years ago. But it still presupposes an able-bodied subject who is agentful and individuated and not tethered to a community. And I think part of what is crip wisdom and care is like a recognition, oh, we are web, we are enmeshed in each other. We don't actually have bodily autonomy, right? Which is something else that we're learning in the age of coronavirus, is like, oh, my actions about harm reduction affect other people that I may never even know. And that kind of intimacy of bodies and ecologies is something that queer and disabled people, sick and disabled people, queer folks, people on the margins of society, certainly incarcerated people who have a relationship to radical forms of imprisonment and confinement, that vulnerable populations in our world have been theorizing how to deal with that question for a long time. And I think part of what I want to do in this project is just amplify that and make that more known, if that makes sense. So that's how I'm thinking healing. I want to problematize. I don't even really want to define the concept of healing. I want to define all of the problems that surround the problem, the way we're thinking about healing in this moment, because it might get us to a different space. It might get us to a different place about how to heal, which is to say how to transform our world in a more just way, if that makes sense.
Oh, could I add something else on that?
Yeah, please.
And that definition of self-care, do you think it becomes inaccessible to people who might not have time or resources to access the spa, let's say?
Right. Well, that's part of the problem, right? It's like, why is self-care only the purchase of wealthy people in the investor class, and people who have disposable income in order to produce, who are not working 3 jobs? I mean, I think about my student population; it's majority minority campus, first generation students who are all working 40 hours of work week, and mostly as emergency workers or as frontline workers in the context of this COVID-19 crisis. How do you tell somebody to talk about self-care in that context, right? Instead, it's to say, how do we actually reinvest in all of the spaces, all the infrastructures that have been divested from in our society, which is like the public health infrastructure and education spaces and all of those broader systems that we've been talking about, in order to revivify people's life chances. Because I think at the end of the day, it's like, how do we downwardly redistribute power, resources, and life chances? That's what healing justice is about. It's about getting wellness. And we know so much about chronic illness. I mentioned early in my talk the language of chronic wellness, which I'm sort of saying facetiously, but I think like we have such a diagnosis of chronic illness. We have such a diagnosis of all of the disparities that Black and brown communities experience in the United States, right, and around the world. We know the story of how even coronavirus is disproportionately impacted, and like saying is a form of low intensity domestic counterinsurgency against communities of color in this country. So we know that story, but we have very few modalities say, well, like, how do we actually be chronically well? How do we expand wellness? We know the story about premature death over and over again in all these spaces. How do we sustain our lives in our institutions and else otherwise, right? So that's the bit at the end where I was talking about Grace Hong and the way she talks about Black feminism in the academy and this litany of all these Black women who've died as university workers and professors in their 50s of cancer and other things, including my own mentor who died in his 40s, right? Like, we know that narrative. How do we make sure that queer and trans, Black, Indigenous people of color survive and thrive and live long lives, right? And that's a huge undertaking, obviously, in ways that are beyond the scope of our conversations on the one hand, and yet are precisely crucial to the kinds of dreams and visions and aspirations that we should have as creative people. I don't know.
Yeah,
Eli?
Definitely. We have a great comment on that in the chat from Emily Clamer again. Thank you. I was like, who is going to the spa?
Nobody should be going to the spa right now.
That's very true. Maureen is also here with a question in the chat. She says, I want to ask about the Midwestness of your focus. It's often the North Midwest that is the most segregated and white supremacist. We had a talk last week on that very topic. BIPOC folks experience white supremacy most keenly in the North Midwest. How do you square that with the resistance movements you see here in the Midwest?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you, Maureen. And yes, was precisely the element I was thinking of. I wanted to lift up the most, and then I somehow downplayed it in the talk. But I starting small with Chicago and looking at the organizing and Let Us Breathe. But it's also, isn't it interesting that some of the most spectacular sites of rebellion and insurgency in this year have been in our cities, in Milwaukee, in Minneapolis, in Chicago, of course, we know about Ferguson and St. Louis. And I think part of what needs to happen is our scholarship and activism and discourse about rebellion and Black BIPOC rebellion in the United States needs to catch up to the reality about, just as you're naming all of the kind of vicissitudes of white supremacy and anti-Black racism that people experience across the North Midwest, but also that these are very vibrant sites that are, post-industrialized sites that are innovating and experimenting with new forms of collective care and mutual aid and transformative justice as a product of the devastations of neoliberal capitalism over the last several decades. And I think, somebody who went to grad school in New York, went to undergrad in California, but is from Chicago, and thinks a lot about how even in our national discussions, there's such very little regard or discussion still about all the things that are happening in our cities in the Midwest. And I think about our mayor Lightfoot, right? The way that was covered when she won office, and the ways that young mostly Black and BIPOC activists who were calling attention to her record before coming into office was completely ignored in the mainstream national press. And there was all this sort of difference incorporated celebration of this being the first Black lesbian mayor in Chicago, and what a joyous occasion. And she's still riding that high of a kind of neoliberal multicultural politics that is deeply symbolic and non-redistributive. And in fact, it is upwardly redistributive. And, so those of us in Chicago who are paying attention, and I just want to lift up all the amazing anti-carceral organizing that's happening in my city. It's pushing back against the Lightfoot administration and all the kind of horrific choices that she's made in her short time and tenure in the office. Hi, Mayor Lightfoot, if you're zoomed in with us, and watching, or people in your office, colleagues included. It's like, how can we pay attention to what's happening in the Midwest, and not to exceptionalize what's happening here, right? That wasn't the impetus behind my question, but it was to say, hey, there's something really innovative happening here. And it's not surprising that domestic wars on terror, of which we're experiencing the vestiges of and the ongoing instantiations, there would be resistance, coalitional resistance emanating out of our cities in ways that I don't think people have grasped and fully wrap their brains around, probably because they don't see the efflorescence of BIPOC life in these cities.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for taking my question, Rona.
My pleasure.
And then we have one more in the chat here. We're all right to keep going, right, Maureen? Past 4:30. Okay. Jen Fishman asks, I've been teaching 9/11 and the coronavirus in my undergrad writing classes. I wonder, should we be aware of any kind of accumulated exhaustion that stems from that event over the past 20 years, and perhaps is amplified or transmogrified in specific and recognizable ways? To restate, what about our experiences now should we understand as or in relation to 9/11 and its aftermath?
That's such a huge question. It's always the huge question, right, that comes in after the bell has rung. Well, I've been thinking about how my undergrads at UIC, I'm teaching a large asynchronous 150-person lecture right now. Hi, folks, if you're tuned in. Those folks were born after 9/11. They're so they are the No Child Left Behind generation of the Bush II era. The forever wars on terror in the Greater Middle East are your entire life, right? The last 2 decades of life. The Great Recession happened, when you were in grade school, and now we have the, potential Great Depression and all the calamities of this moment that are even more perilous. So I think there's an ever presence. I wonder if 9/11 will be the kind of, part of in my book, I try to dislodge the idea of post 9/11. And I talk about the long history of the long 20th century and the way the US and European colonial powers were involved in the Middle East earlier in the late Cold War that then explain a lot of the circumstances of what happened, on 9/11 onwards. And in a similar way, I wonder, like, how will we backdate this moment of global pandemic and COVID-19 and, all of the strands of climate apocalypse and chaos that have been happening for the last several decades, all of the, predatory migrations that are happening, all the climate refugees. I mean, all this, it's like humans' relationship to the environment that produce coronaviruses, right? Like that produce this problem. And it's like, yeah, instead of the one-off spectacular trauma of 9/11 and then all the wars to come, we're just living a kind of low intensity form of trauma every day. So there's a different temporality to what we're experiencing now than that earlier moment. It's also such that the last 2 decades have so, as I talk about in my book, have so captured our imaginations about how to talk about safety and security and anything, like the securitized logics have so framed the way we talk about danger and risk and peril and the relationships of immigrants and migrants, refugees, that coronavirus is a biosecurity panic too, right? And of course, all the racial contagion and the kind of hate crimes that Asian Americans are experiencing, Asian North Americans are experiencing this year because of the anti-Chinese sentiment that the Trump regime and others have proliferated. All of that is happening, and it's a security panic, and it's about stultifying our human sociality and touch and relationship with each other. Like here we are in our computer screens, right? Not able to be in conversation with each other, not be able to be in person. Like part of what my book was about is like, how do we revivify touch and the sensorial, because the state and its warfare apparatus is so invested in evacuating the senses from us so that we will be estranged from each other. So we won't know why we are each other's allies or accomplices in whatever struggle, right? Like that's the work of counterinsurgency. It's to divide and conquer the population. And in some sense, you get a viral pandemic that's precisely about dividing and conquering, right? It's about producing a contagion effect that stigmatizes certain groups of people, undermines the life chances of other groups of people, and creates these kinds of dissonances and separations and apartheid structures. And so I think people will be studying the relationship between 9/11 and COVID-19 for a long time. There's a lot of really amazing work around HIV/AIDS activists thinking through coronavirus and harm reduction in this moment. And I want to lift up the work of the HIV doulas who say, well, how would an HIV doula talk about coronavirus? And, what does it mean, think of an HIV doula as a compelling and expansive notion too, right? How do we be doulas for the end of US empire? Like the birth of, this is a long deadening project. That's a whole other conversation, right? But we are experiencing the dying effects of US empire, the late vestiges. That's my argument. And it's going to produce all these racialized spikes of violence, interpersonal and state violence. And of course, migrants, working class people, undocumented people, queer people, trans people, sick and disabled people are the folks who are most vulnerable to those spikes. And that's partly what makes this a perilous time, but it's also a recognition that there's a kind of knowledge and genius in those movements, in those communities, that is precisely the thing that we want to re-amplify and spread around and make viral and contagious as well. So that's what I would say. I'm just rambling now because it's
no, I love that. That was great.
Friday afternoon, and it's been a long day, long week.
We have one last question in the chat here. After a comment, St. Louis represent, thank you for including us. Someone asks, can you expand on your comment on Asian American solidarity? How can we people of Asian origin bring this back to our communities?
That's such a good question. And I think, what is the work of there's anti-Black racism in all of our communities. And, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning is like, okay, we are all having certain kinds of conversations about anti-Black racism and global white supremacy in our communities and doing that work. And that is hard, messy, and long-standing projects that we should engage. And I think there are really incredible examples of Asian American solidarity and radical relationality with Black freedom struggles throughout the 20th century into the 21st century. We know that story, right? We also know that Black and brown broadly defined, right? Multiracial, pan-racial, US third worldism in the 21st century. Like this is a moment to reactivate all of those traditions and to to learn about those traditions in our communities. We don't know those stories, and then proliferate them as a kind of antidote to the everyday casual forms of anti-Black racism and anti-colorism and colorism and casteism and all the other things that are the toxic elements of our communities. And so that's the work of all people, and I was specifically talking to non-Black people of color in that regard earlier in the talk. It's also a recognition that this moment, and I mentioned it, I'm not showing my screen anymore, but I had more to say about, there's really incredible creative projects that young Asian American activists are doing in relationship to all of the questions that I brought up. And, maybe I should also lift up, I talk about breath and breathing. Learn about the work of artists like Alejandro Acierto or Patricia Nguyen in Chicago, or the feminist critics Magdalena Gorska and Jean-Thomas Tremblay, who have been writing about breath and breathing for a long time, right? I'm not the first person to come along. And I started to narrate some of the people that are important to me, but there's actually a very rich tradition of art, activism, and criticism on questions of respiration and collective forms of breathing. And again, I'm trying to think of breathing as a metaphor for flight and for freedom and for a kind of political economy that's different than the sort of narrow ways that we think about the redistribution of resources.
And then I think Krista has a question if we have time for another one.
Sure.
Thank you, Ronak, so much for this really enlightening and inspiring end of a tough week. I think a lot about healing and collectivity through my own production and sharing of food, and food as a way of connecting and healing, also as a way of finding my mind body. I often and that was like a really compelling thing for you to say that's clicking some gears in my head. So thank you for that. But oftentimes when I'm feeling incredibly stressed, I'll go to kneading bread or making pasta or something like that as a way of using my body in certain ways so that it clears my mind to think in different pathways. So I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about how you have seen or how you can imagine that food or sustenance and sharing of food plays into this project. And if you've seen any folks bridge food, art, healing.
There's a lot of amazing food justice organizing work happening in Chicago. Part of that is like land back movements that Black radicals are doing about urban farming and in the city of Chicago taking over plots. And so I think urban farming and foodways is an important strand here. Of course, food traditions are extraordinarily ancestral, old and new, right? Like, there's sourdough starters from April 2020, which feels like 1,000 years ago, that everyone had in their houses. But there's also just the rich feminist, womanist, Black and brown traditions of food being the way movements have been lubricated, right? And even Rachel, Professor Buff mentioned that it's too bad that we can't be in person to break bread, right? And so all of our metaphors are saturated also with food logics, I think, in ways that are important. But so food certainly plays an extraordinarily important role in movement cultures. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head, and I'm just a little maybe too burnt out today to think of the people who are writing about food in ways in relationship to these questions, but there are a ton of people doing incredible work on food and race and culture and politics and warfare. There's also just a recognition that food is craft, like what you mentioned about, and I'm feeling it very intensely, somebody who really wasn't a master chef before this year. I think sometimes limitations and constraints of the outside world force us to develop survival strategies that we either had or didn't have or need to hone. Is everyone shaking their head like everyone is their own sous chef? Yeah, like I'm whipping up stuff all over the place in ways that I could never have imagined a year ago. And I think that has absolutely been a meditative practice. It's been a way for me to connect with other people, even virtually. And and it's not surprising that food is primarily something that is enlivened in feminist traditions, because there's a very gendered economy, of course, and who produces food, how does food circulate as clearly a way to care for others, as Maureen is saying in the chat here. Absolutely, all that is true. And it's also like, I think about the projects after the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and, any sort of disaster capitalist zone,
what is the number one thing is like figure out how to get emergency supplies and food to large groups of people. So there's food is sustenance, food is life, and also it is just like breath. It is a kind of circulatory. It's a form of circulation through which we can trace these lineages and forms of connection. Yeah, thank you for that. All the way people are feeding each other in the marches this summer and beyond. Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to need it all the more come our Midwestern winter ahead, for sure. And all the things, all the forms of uncertainty that are, facing us in the here and now. Yeah.
Any other questions, or do we want to end it on that note?
That just made me hungry, so
I know I'm
ready to roll.
A little hungry too.
Let me say, first, thank you all to all of you. This has been really wonderful, and thanks everybody in the YouTube streaming, and all of you in the Zoom chat. I've really appreciated this conversation, and thank you for giving me space to sort of think through new ideas that are not fully fleshed out and fully formed. I think that that's an important practice to model as well. That our ideas are always changing, and the craft is part of the work here as well. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ronak. That was worth waiting for.
Yes.
Thank you. Beautiful talk.
Thank you. I think that Ronak deserves his own time to breathe now after that. So we can all sign off. Thanks again for joining us today at UW-Milwaukee. We really appreciate it.